Chapter 2 Dead Men Teaching. The bus ride up to Ridge Avenue took just 10 minutes. It turned out to be a long 10 minutes. By stepping on board, I committed myself. Our driver, Mrs. Gardner, wouldn't let us off once we were on, not until we reached Don Towers Middle School. So changing my mind and running home to Mom was off the table. All I could do was sit stiffly on the seat beside Mike, trembling and not saying anything as the bus trundled up the hill, picking up kids every few blocks or so. And the more I sat there, the less sure I was of what I'd seen. After all, dead guys didn't walk around, did they? They didn't grab you only to have their hands snap off in your shirt, right? I don't know what had happened outside my house, but I was slowly managing to convince myself that it had been some kind of weird hallucination. A bad Pop-Tart, maybe? When we reached the school, I staggered from the bus in a daze of confusion and uncertainty. I bumped into Mike on the way down the narrow steps, making him snap. "Geez, what's the matter with you?" "I don't know," I replied, still feeling the dry clutch of Pratt's dead hand on my arm. "Are you sick or something?" "Maybe." "Well, see you." And with that, Mike veered away, looking uncomfortable. "He thinks I'm nuts." The student entrance was always manned by a couple of teachers whose job it was to make sure that everybody got inside before the bell rang. Today it was Mr. Lafferty's turn. Lafferty was a gym coach, a big impatient guy who kept ordering everyone to keep moving through the doors. Across from him, eyeing the lazy march of kids passing under his nose, stood Assistant Principal Teitelbaum. I wouldn't have recognized him if not for the stupid flower he always wore in the lapel of his fancy suit, because the guy inside that suit was dead. He wasn't as dead as Old Man Pratt had been. Well, of course, he was as dead, just not for as long. Where Mr. Pratt had been dried up husk cracking open here and there when he turned his head, Mr. Teitelbaum was still juicy. His flesh appeared tight and transparent, the muscles beneath visible, the skin moist and faintly purple. His head was moving slowly back and forth, his dead eyes scanning the crowd, looking for what? They settled on me. Gasping, I stumbled sideways, trying to get as close to Mr. Lafferty's side of the student entrance as I could. "Yo! Watch it, Red!" someone yelled as I bumped into him. "Sorry," I muttered. Feeling dizzy with fear, I somehow managed to make it through the school doors. "Hey, Will!" There was Brian Kowalski, one of my best friends. I tried to smile, but I couldn't manage it. Brian didn't notice. "You study for the math test?" he asked. "Uh-huh," I replied. And the thing is, I had, but that had been last night when my life had been a whole lot simpler. "Not me. Fell asleep watching CSI. My mom freaked. Now she says I'm going to flunk, and it serves me right." It sounded like a mom thing to say. "I'm ready anyway," Brian unconvincingly declared. "But can I copy off of you, in case I'm not?" "Whatever," I told him. A typical day at school. Homeroom came and went. My homeroom teacher, plump Mrs. Carvelli, was clearly and blessedly unzombie-like. She led us through the Pledge of Allegiance and the morning announcements, and then wished us all a good day when the bell rang. Oops. Sorry. I considered talking to her and telling her what was happening to me. I didn't. Instead, Brian and I marched off to first period math, with Brian still fretting over the test, and me just praying that our teacher, Mrs. Yu, would be alive and well. She wasn't. "Oh, crap," I breathed, staring at the corpse by the blackboard. "Relax," Brian whispered. "I mean, you studied, right? I don't want to be copying off of you if you didn't study." Saying nothing, I averted my eyes and took my assigned seat in the third row. Brian sat catty-corner and 2 rows back. I heard him shift his chair a little closer. "Get settled," the Ms. Yu thing said in her heavily accented English. "We have a test today." "Hey, Red," said a voice from beside me, and despite everything, my spirits lifted a little. Helene, spelled with 3 E's, but pronounced with 3 A's. Boschetter dropped into the desk next to mine. Just as she did every math class, at the sight of her, my mouth went a little dry, and all thoughts of Walking Dead people briefly receded. She absently brushed a lock of her wavy brown hair away from her big hazel eyes. Ready for the test? I struggled for words. It was a problem that happened only in front of her. Well, and zombies, of course. I think so. The Math Queen's tests are always so hard, Helene complained. It's like she's not human or anything. Another rather difficult kind of cold shock ran down my spine. I gaped at Helene speechlessly as, from the blackboard dead, Mrs. Yu declared, "Attention, class! Everyone look at me!" It was the last thing I wanted to do. I did it anyway. What I was looking at was a dried-up carcass, loosely wrapped in a floral print dress and clutching a pile of stapled papers in one gray, bony fist. Bits of flaky skin fluttered off of her, covering the floor like weird confetti. There were beetles following her with every step she took. They seemed to be feeding on the confetti. I glanced around at the other kids. None of them looked nervous except for Brian, of course, who hadn't studied. But they didn't see that she was a corpse. They didn't even seem to see the bugs. "There will be no talking," she said. "Your eyes will be on your papers. Forget the clock. Focus only on your test." "You okay?" Helene whispered. I nodded miserably, wishing I could confide in her, but realizing that her remark about Ms. Yu had just a joke, one of those things that yesterday we'd have laughed about and then forgotten. Helene wouldn't have believed me. No one would. The telephone on the back wall beside the door suddenly rang. I actually let out a startled yelp. A few kids around me chuckled. "You don't look okay," Helene remarked dryly. Her speech interrupted. Dead woman Yu moved to the phone, using an ungainly shuffle that sloughed more little gray flakes off her decaying body. They left a gruesome trail across the tile floor that the beetles seemed to love. Lifting the receiver in one bony hand, she uttered the phrase that, as always, learned her a laugh from class. "I am you!" I didn't join in the merriment. Neither did Helene. The corpse flashed the class an annoyed look. Then she listened to the voice on the other end of the line. As I watched, her withered and blackened body grew stiff. No pun intended. She turned her head and looked right at me. "It's Mr. Pratt! He's called the school to tell Mr. Teitelbaum and Miss Yu that I can see them, that I can see them all." Without really knowing why, I glanced at Helene, who met my eyes. Amazingly, she whispered, "Don't panic." Our deceased math teacher replaced the receiver. "William Ritter," she said, "you are to report to Mr. Teitelbaum's office immediately." I didn't move. Couldn't move. The corpse's rotted eye sockets narrowed. Something that looked horribly like a smile flashed across her skeletal face. "Do you hear me, Mr. Ritter?" "Yes, ma'am." Moving in slow motion, as though trapped in a nightmare, I collected my books and stood, ignoring the dismayed look on Brian's face. The classroom was as quiet as a graveyard. The other kids somehow sensed that something very bad was going down. My dead math teacher watched me march slowly toward the door. "As soon as I'm in the hallway, I'll run for the nearest exit. I'll get home somehow, walk or hitch if I have to. I'll tell Mom what's happening. I'll make her believe me." But as the classroom door closed behind me, I knew that wouldn't be possible. Dead man Teitelbaum stood 20 feet away at the end of the corridor to my right. To my left, 2 more zombies were waiting. I didn't know who they were, although both wore janitor's overalls. They were the juicy kind, like the assistant principal. Together, their three sets of lifeless yet malevolent eyes burned hungrily into me, their dripping, decaying bodies blocking any hope of escape. "This way, William," Mr. Teitelbaum commanded. He waggled one purple, swollen finger at me. I clutched my books to my chest, paralyzed. Please. I felt a tear trace down my cheek. I want my mom. No mom, boy, the assistant principal said, this time speaking in that strange way that old man Pratt had, without moving his lifeless lips. Go on and cry. Suddenly, I found myself praying that I was crazy. Crazy had to be better than what these things had in mind. The zombies advanced. I knew I ought to run, but my legs wouldn't budge. Ms. Yu's classroom door burst open behind me. "Move!" a voice exclaimed. I was shoved roughly aside. My books crashed to the floor as the figure darted past me. As I watched, thunderstruck, Helene Bocher crossed the corridor at a run and yanked down on the fire alarm. An electronic horn blared out of the school's PA system. The three zombies stopped. Seconds later, doors started opening up and down the hallway. Kids filed out, all wearing that interested, somewhat amused expression that comes from whenever something unexpected breaks up the day's routine. If they only knew. I felt the first faint whisper of hope. Then a dry, bony hand dropped onto my shoulder. Miss Yu's voice whispered in my ear. "What do you see, Mr. Ritter?" A dozen feet away on either side of me, the zombies had recovered themselves and were focusing their attention on Helene now. Dead Man Teitelbaum charged at her, moving with surprising speed, his strong hands extended. Seemingly unafraid, Helene reached behind her back and produced a gun. Except it wasn't a real gun. It was a molded plastic and dried pale blue. A water pistol? Standing there with Mrs. Yu's dead fingers digging painfully into my shoulder, the notion struck me, crazy as it was, that Helene would be expelled for bringing that thing to school. As the assistant principal neared her, Helene fired a stream of water right into his face. To my astonishment, the dead man staggered back, clutching at his eyes as though blinded. Then, spinning on her heel, she fired twice more at the deceased janitors. This time she aimed low, catching them in the pant legs. One of them changed direction, marched right into the wall, knocking off a mounted fire extinguisher. There he stood, twitching helplessly. The other one's legs stopped altogether. The corpse, unbalanced and his arms pinwheeling, crashed to the floor. When he tried to get up, I saw with horror that some of his face stuck to the floor and peeled away, revealing the underlying muscles. Helene ignored them, crossed the hall, and fired another stream over my shoulder. It nailed dead woman Yu full in the face, driving her back through the open classroom door. I stood, stunned, barely able to register what was happening. A small, warm hand closed around mine. "If you don't want to die," Helene said, "follow me." Well, that's it. That's all I'm going to read to you guys. I do have his books, some of his books in the library, and then he's also selling to the books 3 and 4 when he comes to see us on Friday. So we're looking forward to Ty's visit. I hope you enjoyed the story, and I hope you'll continue reading it. Talk to you later. Bye.